Fourth-generation farmer Jack Donovan gave his entire winter wheat harvest to a desperate family stranded in a devastating blizzard, sacrificing his last chance to save his debt-ridden family farm. 2 days later, with an eviction notice on his door and nowhere to go, Jack awoke to the rumble of 50 tractors rolling through his front gate and discovered the father of those stranded children was Michael Reeves, the new CEO of Heartland Agricultural Cooperative, who possessed a power that would transform Jack's life in ways he never imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Donovan's weathered hands moved methodically across the ancient tractor's engine, his fingers finding each problem by memory and feel rather than sight. At 45, Jack's face carried the permanent tan and fine creases of a man who had spent his life under an open sky, his strong frame lean from physical labor rather than deliberate exercise. The early December wind bit through his canvas jacket as he worked, but Jack barely noticed the cold. A lifetime in northern Montana had made him impervious to all but the harshest weather. "Come on, old girl," he murmured to the 1978 John Deere that had belonged to his father. "Just one more season, that's all I'm asking." From the nearby barn, Jack's border collie Rusty barked twice before racing across the frost-covered ground toward the gravel driveway. A battered pickup truck approached, its familiar rattle announcing Jack's younger brother Dave before he came into view. Jack wiped his greasy hands on a rag and straightened, wincing slightly as his lower back protested. 25 years of working the land had left their mark, though he'd never admit it to anyone, least of all Dave, who'd escaped farm life for a teaching job in Riverdale, the nearest town 30 miles away. "Should have known I'd find you fixing something," Dave called as he climbed from his truck. At 40, Dave carried the Donovan features, strong jaw, clear blue eyes, but his hands were smooth, his shoulders unburdened by the weight of a struggling family legacy. "Tractor doesn't fix itself," Jack replied with a half-smile. Despite the occasional envy he felt for his brother's simpler life, there was no real resentment between them. Dave had offered numerous times to help financially, but Jack's pride had always prevented him from accepting. The brothers walked toward the 2-story farmhouse that had been in the Donovan family for over a century. Its white paint was peeling, and the wraparound porch sagged slightly on the western corner, but to Jack it was still the most beautiful building in Elk County. "Coffee's still hot," Jack said as they entered the warm kitchen. The house was modest, but meticulously maintained inside, with the original hardwood floors his great-grandfather had installed, and the sturdy oak table around which 4 generations of Donovans had shared meals. Dave settled at the table while Jack poured 2 mugs of coffee. On the kitchen wall hung family photographs spanning decades. Jack and Dave as boys, helping their father with the harvest. Their mother proudly displaying a prize-winning pumpkin. Their grandparents standing beside the first tractor the family ever owned. Most prominently displayed was a faded photograph of Jack's great-grandparents, William and Mary Donovan, standing in front of the newly built farmhouse in 1922. "How's Sarah?" Jack asked, referring to Dave's wife as he set the mugs down. "Good. Busy with the Christmas pageant? She's got 43rd graders singing Jingle Bells without total chaos, which is nothing short of miraculous." Dave wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "The kids were asking about you. Thought maybe you'd come for dinner Sunday. Sarah's making that pot roast you like." Jack nodded, though they both knew he rarely left the farm these days. There was always too much to do, too many repairs, too little help. After his wife Karen had left 8 years ago, unable to weather the financial uncertainty of farm life and the isolation of rural Montana, Jack had retreated further into his work, finding solace in the rhythm of seasons and the predictability of crops, if not markets. "You didn't drive all this way to invite me to dinner," Jack said finally. Dave had that look, concerned, cautious, that Jack had come to recognize over the years. Dave sighed. "Sarah saw Ms. Winters from Riverdale Farmers Bank in town yesterday. There's talk about your loan." Jack's jaw tightened. He'd hoped to have more time before word spread. Riverdale was small, just over 5,000 people, and news traveled fast, especially bad news about one of the county's oldest farming families. "My business with the bank is private," Jack said, more sharply than he'd intended. "Not in Riverdale, it isn't," Dave countered. "Jack, if you're in trouble again, I'm handling it." Jack stood and moved to the window overlooking his fields. The winter wheat he'd planted in September stood in neat rows, still green despite the early December chill. This variety, a drought-resistant strain he'd invested nearly everything in after 2 failed harvests, was his last hope to save the farm. The truth Jack couldn't bring himself to share was that Donovan Farm was 3 months behind on its mortgage. The bank had granted him extensions based on the projected yield of his winter wheat, but their patience was wearing thin. If he couldn't deliver a harvest substantial enough to make a significant payment by the end of the month, Riverdale Farmers Bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. "You know," Dave said carefully, "the offer still stands. Sarah and I have that money from her parents. We could—" "No," Jack cut him off firmly. "I told you before, I'm not taking your savings. This farm has been in our family for 4 generations. It's my responsibility now." Dave ran a hand through his hair in frustration, a gesture so like their father that Jack had to look away. "It's not just your responsibility, Jack. It's your life, all of it. When's the last time you even left the county? Took a day off? The farm was never meant to be a prison." Jack remained silent. How could he explain to Dave that the farm wasn't a prison, but his purpose? That despite the hardships, the droughts, the equipment breakdowns, the rising costs, and falling crop prices, he still felt the same connection to this land that had sustained their family through the Dust Bowl, 2 world wars, and countless personal tragedies. The Donovan men don't quit. That's what their grandmother had said countless times during Jack's childhood. Her words had carried him through Karen's departure, through the crop failures, through the lonely nights when the enormity of preserving the family legacy threatened to crush him. "The wheat looks good," Jack said finally, changing the subject. "Best crop I've had in years, drought-resistant and high-yield. If the weather holds, I should have enough to settle with the bank and have seed money for spring planting." Dave looked skeptical, but didn't press further. He knew his brother well enough to recognize when a subject was closed. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, wrapped package. "Early Christmas present," he said, pushing it across the table. Sarah insisted. Jack unwrapped it carefully to find a framed photograph, a newly restored version of the oldest family photo they possessed, showing their great-grandfather standing proudly on the land he'd just purchased in 1919, 3 years before the house was built. Sarah had it digitally restored, Dave explained. "Found a guy online who specializes in old photographs." Jack ran his finger along the frame, emotion tightening his throat. In the photo, William Donovan stood tall, despite his visible exhaustion, his eyes reflecting the same determination Jack saw in the mirror each morning. "Thank her for me," Jack managed, setting the photograph carefully on the table beside the family Bible that contained records of births, deaths, and harvests stretching back a century. They talked for another hour, about Dave's students, about the county's declining population as more young people left for cities, about the weather forecast that predicted heavy snow in the coming week. What remained unspoken was their shared fear that Jack might be the last Donovan to farm this land, that a legacy a century in the making might end on his watch. As Dave prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Promise me something, Jack. If things get worse, you'll call before it's too late. Pride won't keep the farm running. Jack nodded, though they both knew it was a promise he might not keep. After his brother's truck disappeared down the long driveway, Jack returned to his work. On the tractor, his movements more determined than before. Above him, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, hinting at the approaching storm that would test both his resolve and the Donovan legacy in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Rusty settled nearby, watching his master with unwavering loyalty as the afternoon light began to fade. In the growing darkness, Jack worked by the beam of a single floodlight, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, his mind fixed on the wheat that represented his last, best hope. The next morning dawned clear and bitingly cold, the kind of crystalline December day that made the vast Montana landscape glitter like it had been dusted with diamonds. Jack rose before the sun as he had every day since childhood, moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Coffee brewing, Rusty fed, weather report checked, and a hearty breakfast of eggs and toast to fuel the day's labor. Jack's kitchen radio crackled with the local station's morning farm report as he pulled on his heavy work boots. And farmers across Elk County should prepare for what meteorologists are calling potentially historic winter conditions. The announcer warned. The National Weather Service has issued a blizzard warning beginning tomorrow afternoon, with accumulations of 18 to 24 inches possible by Friday. Temperatures are expected to drop well below zero, with wind chills approaching -30. Jack frowned, moving to the kitchen window. The clear blue sky betrayed no hint of the coming storm, but he'd lived in Montana long enough to know how quickly conditions could change. A storm of that magnitude could delay his harvest by days, perhaps even a week, time he simply didn't have if he wanted to meet the bank's deadline. He grabbed his worn leather journal from the kitchen drawer, the latest in a series that stretched back to his great-grandfather's time. Each Donovan man had kept meticulous records of plantings, harvests, weather patterns, and costs. Jack flipped to his most recent calculations, studying the numbers that would determine his future. The winter wheat covered 180 acres of his 240-acre farm. At current market prices, and with the exceptional yield the new strain promised, he would clear enough to make the overdue mortgage payment with a small cushion for spring planting, but only if he could harvest before year's end. Only if the weather cooperated. Only if the equipment held together for one more season. The margins were razor thin, leaving no room for error or bad luck, both of which had been in abundant supply these past few years. 3 consecutive seasons of drought had depleted his financial reserves. The unexpected breakdown of his combine harvester last spring had forced him to rent equipment at exorbitant rates. And all the while, the bank's patience had worn thinner. With each late payment and request for extension, Jack closed the journal with a decisive snap. If the storm was coming tomorrow, he needed to assess the wheat today. Perhaps some portions were mature enough for early harvest. Not ideal, but better than losing everything to snow and ice. Outside, Rusty bounded ahead of Jack as they made their way toward the eastern fields, where the wheat stood in neat rows, stretching toward the horizon. The morning sun warmed Jack's face as he walked the perimeter, stopping occasionally to examine the wheat stalks with experienced hands. "Looking good, aren't you?" he murmured, running his fingers along the green heads, feeling the developing kernels through their protective husks. The crop wasn't ready. 2 more weeks would yield the perfect harvest, but parts of the easternmost section were further along than others. Jack made calculations as he walked. With his old combine, he could harvest maybe 20 acres before the storm hit. Not enough to satisfy the bank, but perhaps enough to demonstrate good faith, enough to buy more time. His cell phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The screen showed Patricia Winter's name, and Jack's stomach tightened. When the bank called this early, it was rarely good news. "Ms. Winters," he answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Mr. Donovan." Her tone was professionally cordial, but with an unmistakable edge of finality. "I've just come from the board meeting. I wanted to call you personally before the official notice is sent." Jack stopped walking, his free hand instinctively gripping a wheat stalk. "What notice?" "I'm sorry, Jack." For the first time in their long acquaintance, Patricia used his first name, a shift that signaled the conversation had moved beyond business. "The board has voted unanimously to deny any further extensions. Your final payment is due December 31st, as stipulated in your last agreement. If payment isn't received in full by close of business that day, foreclosure proceedings will begin." January 2nd. The wheat stalk snapped in Jack's grip. "Patricia, you know the situation. The crop is almost ready. I just need—" "It's out of my hands," she interrupted gently. "The decision is final. I truly am sorry." After the call ended, Jack stood motionless in the middle of his field, the phone still clutched in his hand. Around him, the wheat he'd nurtured from seed waved gently in the winter breeze, oblivious to the economic forces threatening its caretaker. Rusty circled back, sensing Jack's distress, and pressed against his leg with a soft whine. "It's okay." "Boy," Jack said automatically, though nothing was okay at all. The reality he'd been fighting finally crashed over him in waves he could no longer hold back. Unless a miracle occurred, in less than a month, Donovan Farm would belong to Riverdale Farmers Bank. 4 generations of history, struggle, triumph, and tradition would end with him. Jack Donovan would be the last of his name to work this land. He looked around at the fields his family had tended for a century, where his father had taught him to drive a tractor at age 8, where his grandfather had weathered the Great Depression by planting crops no one thought would grow in Montana. Soil where his great-grandfather had staked his claim and built a legacy from nothing. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though to whom, his ancestors, the land itself, or his own future, he couldn't say. By mid-afternoon, Jack had formulated a desperate plan. He would attempt an early harvest on the most mature section of his crop before the blizzard hit. It wouldn't be enough to save the farm, but it might provide leverage for one final appeal to the bank. He spent hours preparing his combine harvester, repairing and adjusting every component to ensure it would run through the night if necessary. As dusk approached, Jack paused his work to answer another call, this time from Dave. "Just checking that you're preparing for this storm," his brother said without preamble. "They're saying it could be the worst in decades. Sarah wants you to come stay with us until it passes." Jack glanced at the harvester he'd just spent hours readying. "Can't do that. I'm planning to harvest what I can before it hits." There was a long silence on the line. "Jack, that's not safe. You know how quickly conditions can deteriorate when these systems move in." "Don't have much choice," Jack replied, his voice flat. "Got a call from Patricia Winters this morning. Boards denied any more extensions. Payments due December 31st, or they start foreclosure January 2nd. Another silence, heavier this time. "I'm sorry, Jack. We could still—" "No," Jack cut him off. "We've been through this. I'm not taking your money, Dave. It's not just my money. It's family money. This is a family farm." Jack sighed, rubbing his forehead where a tension headache was building. "It's my responsibility. Has been since Dad died. I took it on, and I'll see it through, whatever that means." "Stubbornness isn't going to save the farm," Dave said, frustration edging into his voice. "Maybe not, but it's all I've got left." Jack ended the call before his brother could respond, knowing he'd been harsh but unable to face Dave's concern or offers of help. Not today. As night fell, Jack checked the weather radar once more. The storm had accelerated, now expected to arrive by mid-morning rather than afternoon. He'd need to start harvesting at first light if he hoped to salvage even a portion of his crop. He forced down a simple dinner of soup and bread, then settled at the kitchen table with his ledger and a calculator. The numbers hadn't changed, but he studied them again anyway. searching for some solution he might have overlooked, some lifeline he hadn't yet grabbed. The family Bible sat open nearby, its pages turned to the record of Donovan harvests spanning a century. Jack ran his finger along the entries, each one a testament to his family's resilience, the drought of 34 that his grandfather had somehow survived when neighboring farms failed, the locust swarm of 56 that had destroyed half their crop but left enough to carry them through winter, the early frost of 78 that his father had fought through the night, lighting smudge pots throughout the fields to protect the vulnerable plants. Donovans didn't surrender to nature or banks or bad luck. They adapted. They persevered. They found a way. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the eaves of the old farmhouse with a mournful sound that matched Jack's mood. Rusty, sensing his master's distress, rested his head on Jack's knee, offering silent companionship. "What would you do, Dad?" Jack asked the empty room. The framed photographs on the wall offered no answer, the faces of his ancestors impassive. In their eternal poses, he closed the Bible gently and stood, decision made. Starting at dawn, he would harvest whatever he could before the storm hit. It might not be enough to save the farm, but he would face whatever came next, knowing he had fought until the end, had honored the Donovan legacy with every fiber of his being. As Jack prepared for bed, he paused at the window overlooking his fields. In the moonlight, the wheat appeared silver, undulating like a ghostly ocean under the strengthening wind. Beautiful, even now, especially now. Whatever happened with the bank, the land would endure. The wheat would grow again next season, whether under his care or someone else's. Perhaps that was the true legacy of the Donovans. Not ownership of these particular acres, but the devotion they had shown to nurturing what grew upon them. The careful stewardship that had transformed wilderness into sustenance for generations of families beyond their own. It was a comforting thought, but not comforting enough to ease Jack into peaceful sleep. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind's increasing fury and wondering what the coming storm would bring, both the one brewing in the skies above and the one threatening to sweep away everything he had ever known and loved. Jack woke before his alarm, roused by a preternatural farmer's instinct that had served generations of Donovans before him. The bedside clock read 4:37 a.m. Outside his window the world remained dark, but a strange quality to the darkness told Jack what his weather app soon confirmed. Snow had already begun to fall, hours ahead of forecast. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling on his clothes with urgent efficiency. He'd planned to begin harvesting at first light around 7:30 a.m. Now he'd be racing the storm from the start. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and Jack's breath clouded. Before him, as he stepped onto the porch, what had started as light flurries was quickly intensifying, the wind driving small, hard flakes horizontally across the yard. Rusty hesitated at the door, reluctant to venture into the biting cold. "Stay inside, boy," Jack told him, which was unusual enough that the border collie tilted his head in surprise. "Not a morning for man nor beast." In the barn, Jack's hands shook from more than just cold as he prepared the combine harvester. The ancient machine had always been temperamental, but in these temperatures, starting it would be a challenge. He'd plugged in the engine block heater last night, a precaution that now seemed prescient. But even so, the diesel engine protested with a series of coughs and sputters before reluctantly rumbling to life. The harvester's headlights cut through the pre-dawn darkness and swirling snow as Jack guided it toward the eastern wheat field. He'd decided to focus on the 20 acres that showed the most maturity, hoping to salvage at least that much before conditions became impossible. By the time he reached the field, the snow was accumulating rapidly, already forming a thin white blanket over his precious wheat. Jack felt a stab of desperation. Every minute counted now. He engaged the harvester's mechanisms and began the first pass. the machine's rotating reels gathering the wheat stalks and feeding them into the cutting. The work was slow and treacherous. Normally, wheat harvesting was done in dry conditions. Moisture was the enemy of both the grain and the equipment. But Jack had no choice. He hunched forward in the operator's seat, straining to see through the increasingly dense snowfall, making adjustments to the equipment settings to compensate for the wet conditions. 2 hours into the harvest, with barely 3 acres completed, the real storm arrived. What had been merely challenging conditions suddenly transformed into something far more dangerous. The wind intensified to near-gale force, driving snow and ice horizontally across the fields. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet, and the temperature plummeted further, the wind chill approaching the dangerous levels the forecast had warned about. Jack's fingers had long since gone numb, despite his insulated gloves. The combine's cab, never particularly well sealed, let in bitter drafts that cut through his layers of clothing. The moisture from his breath had frozen on his beard and eyelashes, and he had to continually scrape ice from the inside of the windshield. Just one more pass, he promised himself. Though he'd made the same promise 3 passes ago, the rational part of his mind knew he was pushing beyond safety. But the desperate part, the part that couldn't bear to fail his family's legacy, kept. His hands on the controls, the harvester's engine suddenly coughed, sputtered, and then stalled completely. Jack slammed his palm against the dashboard in frustration, turning the key repeatedly, but the engine remained stubbornly silent. Through the frosted windows, he could see that he'd managed to harvest perhaps 5 acres, a quarter of what he'd hoped for and nowhere near enough to make a difference with the bank. The reality of his situation hit him with crushing force. He was stranded in the middle of his field in a historic blizzard, with temperatures dropping to life-threatening levels and no way to get back to the safety of the farmhouse. His truck was parked by the barn, nearly half a mile away across increasingly treacherous terrain. Jack pulled out his cell phone, unsurprised to find no signal. The storm had likely knocked out the nearest tower. Even if he could call for help, emergency services would be overwhelmed, and the rural roads to his farm would be impassable for hours, possibly days. "Guess we're walking," Jack muttered to himself, zipping his coat up to his chin and pulling his hat down as far as it would go. Stepping down from the combine into knee-deep drifts, Jack was immediately assaulted by the full force of the storm. The wind stole his breath, and the driving snow felt like needles against any exposed skin. He oriented himself toward where he knew the farmhouse stood, though he could see nothing but white in every direction. With no landmarks visible, he'd have to rely on instinct and his intimate knowledge of his land to guide him home. Jack had taken perhaps 20 steps when he heard it, faint but unmistakable over the howl of the wind. A car horn, blaring repeatedly, in the universal signal of distress. He stopped, turning in a slow circle, trying to determine the direction of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the county road that ran along the western edge of his property, perhaps a quarter-mile from his current position, but in the opposite direction from the safety of his farmhouse. Every survival instinct told Jack to ignore the sound, to focus on his own precarious situation. In these conditions, hypothermia could set in within minutes. Adding distance to his journey home might be a fatal mistake. But something else, something deeper than self-preservation, moved. Jack's feet in the direction of the distress call. How many times had his father told him that in rural communities like theirs, helping neighbors wasn't charity or kindness, but simple necessity? In a place where professional help might be hours or days away, people survived because they looked out for each other. The journey toward the sound was nightmarish. The snow had drifted in places to Jack's waist, requiring tremendous effort to push through. The wind seemed determined to thwart him, sometimes halting his progress entirely. His extremities had passed beyond pain into dangerous numbness, and His lungs burned with each breath of frigid air. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes, Jack caught sight of a dark shape through the curtain of white. A vehicle half buried in a snowdrift, its rear end projecting into the county road. As he drew closer, he could make out a late model SUV, clearly not built for these conditions despite its four-wheel drive. City car, city driver, Jack thought grimly. The horn had stopped, which worried him. Either the battery had died or the driver had given up. Neither was a good sign. "Hello!" Jack shouted as he approached, his voice immediately swallowed by the storm. "Anyone there?" He reached the driver's side door and brushed snow from the window, peering inside. His heart sank at what he saw. A family of 5, huddled together in obvious distress. A man sat behind the wheel, a woman beside him with an infant clutched to her chest. In the back seat, 2 small children, perhaps 5 and 7, were wrapped in what looked like a single travel blanket, their faces pale with cold and fear. Jack pounded on the window, startling the man, who turned with an expression of desperate hope that nearly broke Jack's heart. The door opened with difficulty against the mounting snow. "Thank God," the man said, his voice shaking. "We've been stuck for hours. Phones dead, cars nearly out of gas. We thought—" He glanced at his children, leaving the grim thought unfinished. "I'm Jack Donovan," Jack said, assessing the situation quickly. "My farm's about half a mile from here. Can you all walk?" The man, Michael, he introduced himself, looked doubtful. "The kids are pretty cold, and Emma just got over pneumonia." He nodded toward the older child. "We were trying to reach my sister's place in Riverdale before the storm hit. GPS took us this way as a shortcut, but we slid off the road." Jack knew immediately that the family couldn't safely make the journey to his farmhouse in these conditions. The children would never make it through the deep snow and biting wind. Even if Michael carried one and Jack the other, the baby and mother would be at severe risk. "How much gas you got left?" Jack asked, an idea forming. "Quarter tank, maybe less. Been running the engine just a few minutes at a time to preserve it." Jack made a quick calculation. His tractor, parked in the barn, could potentially plow through to reach them. But that would take time they might not have. His truck, if he could reach it, might be able to get close enough to help. But again, that meant leaving the family alone while he made the attempt. "Okay, here's what we do," Jack decided. "You're going to drive as far as you can toward my place, that way." He pointed through the blizzard. "I'll walk ahead to mark the way. The road's impassable, but my west field has less drifting. We can get you to my house that way." It was a desperate plan, but the only one Jack could see that might work. Michael nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. "We'll follow you, thank you. You're saving our lives here." Jack didn't waste time on reassurances he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he moved to the front of the SUV, using his body to mark a path as Michael carefully maneuvered the vehicle forward. The going was painfully slow, the SUV's tires spinning and struggling to find purchase in the deep snow. Jack guided them off the drifted road and into his western field, where the standing wheat provided some barrier against the worst of the drifting. The journey that should have taken 5 minutes stretched to nearly 40. Twice, the SUV became stuck, and Jack had to dig frantically with his bare hands to free the tires. The cold had long since penetrated to his bones, his movements becoming progressively slower and less coordinated, early signs of hypothermia that he recognized but couldn't afford to heed. Finally, mercifully, the silhouette of the farmhouse loomed through the whiteout conditions. Jack directed Michael to park as close to the front porch as possible. Together, they hurried the family inside, the children so cold they had to be carried. The warmth of the farmhouse hit Jack like a physical blow as they stumbled through the door. Rusty greeted them with surprised barks, circling the unexpected visitors with wary curiosity. "Get those wet things off," Jack directed, moving immediately to stoke the wood stove to its maximum output. "Blankets in the chest by the sofa. I'll make hot drinks." As Jack moved around the kitchen preparing hot chocolate for the children and coffee for the adults, he watched the family from the corner of his eye. They were clearly not rural people. Their clothing, though expensive, was wholly inadequate for a Montana winter. The father's shoes were leather dress boots, the mother's coat fashionable but not functional. City people, caught unprepared by the ferocity of plains weather. "We can't thank you enough," the woman, Sarah, said as she cradled her infant, now wrapped in one of Jack's grandmother's quilts. "If you hadn't found us." She left the sentence unfinished, her eyes moving to her children, who were already beginning to regain their color as they sipped hot chocolate by the wood stove. Jack waved away the thanks. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Michael said firmly. "Most people wouldn't walk a quarter-mile through a blizzard to help strangers. We owe you our lives, Mr. Donovan." Jack didn't know how to respond to such earnestness. He wasn't used to gratitude. Farming was largely thankless work, and he certainly hadn't been thinking about recognition when he'd turned toward the sound of that horn. "You folks hungry?" he asked instead, changing the subject. "Got plenty of soup. Storm like this might be stuck here a while." As he moved to the pantry, Jack's gaze fell on his kitchen calendar, where December 31st was circled in red, the bank's final deadline. The brief hour he'd managed on the harvester that morning had yielded barely enough wheat to fill a single storage bin, nowhere near what he needed. The blizzard was forecast to last at least 3 days, meaning his crop would be buried until well after the new year. The reality was stark and undeniable. Donovan Farm was lost. No last-minute miracle would save it now. Yet strangely, as Jack ladled homemade potato soup into bowls for the family he'd rescued, he felt an odd sense of peace beneath his exhaustion. Perhaps it was simply the clarity that comes with accepting the inevitable, or perhaps it was something more profound, the knowledge that in his last act as master of this land he had chosen to put others before himself, just as generations of Donovans had done before him. Whatever the future held, Jack knew he could face it without regret. Some things were worth more than land or legacy. Looking at the children warming themselves by his fire, Jack knew he'd made the right choice, the only choice a Donovan could make. Night fell early, as it always did during Montana winters, the darkness arriving by 4:30 and bringing with it an intensification of the storm. The wind howled around the old farmhouse like a living thing, finding every crack and crevice, though the solid construction built by Jack's ancestors kept the worst of it at bay. Outside, the snow continued to fall in blinding sheets, already accumulating to depths that would make travel impossible for days. Jack had given his bedroom to Sarah and the baby, setting up the 2 older children, Emma and Lucas, he'd learned, in the spare room that had once belonged to Dave. Michael slept on the living room sofa, while Jack himself dozed in his father's old recliner by the wood stove, rising every few hours to add more logs and check on his unexpected guests. Around midnight, Jack was awakened by the unmistakable sound of a child's coughing. He found Emma in the kitchen, her small face flushed and her breathing labored. Sarah appeared moments later, concern etched in her tired features. "Her pneumonia," Sarah explained in a whisper. "The doctor said she was recovered, but the cold exposure must have triggered a relapse." Jack felt the child's forehead, burning hot despite the chill in the air. "She needs medicine," he said, stating the obvious. Sarah nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "All our things are in the car. Michael's prescription medications, Emma's antibiotics. We only brought what we needed for the journey." Jack glanced out the window at the SUV, now almost completely buried in drifting snow. Getting to it would be challenging enough. Starting it and driving anywhere would be impossible for days. "There's a first aid kit in the bathroom," Jack said, but it's just basic supplies, nothing for pneumonia." In the dim light of the kitchen, Emma's breathing seemed to grow more labored. The child leaned against her mother, clearly exhausted by the simple effort of drawing breath. "We're 20 miles from the nearest hospital," Jack said grimly, "and no ambulance could get through these roads right now." Sarah's face crumpled. "What can we do?" Jack thought for a long moment, weighing options that all seemed impossible. Then he remembered the storage shed behind the barn. "Wait here," he told Sarah. "Keep her warm. Get her to drink if you can." Outside, the blizzard's fury was undiminished. Jack fought his way through snow that had drifted chest-high in places, the wind threatening to knock him off his feet with each step. The shed, a small metal structure his father had used to store chemicals and sensitive equipment, seemed miles away, though it was barely 100 yards from the house. By the time Jack reached it, his face was numb and his gloves stiff with ice. His hands fumbled with the combination lock, finally forcing it open on the third try. Inside, protected from the elements, sat the snowmobile his father had purchased 20 years earlier for just such emergencies. A relic from an earlier time, but meticulously maintained even after his father's death. Jack hadn't used it in years, but emergency preparedness was ingrained in him. Each fall, he checked it over, filled the tank and made sure it would start if needed. Now, he silently thanked his father for insisting on keeping it long after most farmers in the area had switched to more modern ATVs. It took 3 pulls on the starter cord, but the engine finally roared to life, surprisingly strong for its age. Jack let it idle while he located the emergency supply kit stored nearby, a waterproof container with basic survival equipment, including an old CB radio. Cell towers might be down, but the CB would allow him to contact emergency services if he could get within range of Riverdale. Back in the farmhouse, Michael had joined Sarah and Emma in the kitchen. "You can't be serious," he said when Jack explained his plan. "Going out in this on a snowmobile. It's suicide." "Emma needs antibiotics," Jack replied simply. "Pharmacy in Riverdale keeps emergency supplies for situations like this. I know the pharmacist. He'll open up storm or no storm, but the roads won't be using roads," Jack cut in. "Across the fields is a straight shot to town. 10 miles as the crow flies. Snowmobile can handle the drifts better than any vehicle." Sarah looked at him with desperate hope. "You'd do that? For strangers?" Jack's gaze moved to Emma, whose breathing had grown more labored in just the short time they'd been talking. "Not strangers anymore," he said quietly. "Neighbors now. And in Montana, we don't let neighbors suffer if we can help it." Michael stepped forward, his expression resolute. "Then I'm coming with you." Jack shook his head. "Snowmobile's a one-person job, and your family needs you here." He gestured toward the wood stove. "Fire needs tending every few hours, and I don't know how long the power will hold in this storm. You stay, keep them safe and warm." Reluctantly, Michael nodded. "At least take my wallet, for the medicine." Jack accepted it without argument. Pride had no place when a child's health was at stake. Within minutes, Jack had gathered what he needed. Extra layers of clothing, the emergency kit, a thermos of hot coffee, and a powerful flashlight. He gave Michael a brief tutorial on operating the wood stove and showed him where the emergency supplies were stored. "If the power goes, there's a generator in the barn," Jack explained. "Instructions are taped to it. Should kick in automatically, but if not, the manual switch is on the side." As Jack prepared to leave, Sarah approached with Emma in her arms. The child's breathing had developed a concerning rattle, and her eyes were glassy with fever. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "We'll never forget this." Jack nodded awkwardly, unused to such raw gratitude. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around the lower half of his face, and stepped back into the raging storm. The journey to Riverdale was a nightmare Jack would remember for the rest of his life. Even with the snowmobile's powerful headlight, visibility extended barely 10 feet ahead. He navigated by instinct and memory, knowing his land intimately enough to sense where the fields gave way to fence lines, where culverts might be hiding, beneath the snow, where the terrain dipped and rose. An hour into the journey, he reached the old creek that marked the boundary of his property. In summer, it was a gentle trickle easily crossed on foot. Now, partially frozen and swollen with snowmelt, it presented a treacherous obstacle. Jack studied it for precious minutes, finally identifying a section where ice had formed a tentative bridge. The snowmobile hesitated on the edge, its engine growling in protest, before Jack opened the throttle fully and launched across. For a heart-stopping moment, the ice cracked and groaned beneath the machine's weight. Then, miraculously, he was across, the snowmobile's treads finding purchase on the opposite bank. The land beyond his farm was less familiar, but Jack had hunted these fields since childhood. He pushed forward, fighting the wind that seemed determined to drive him off course, occasionally stopping to consult the compass he'd brought. The cold seeped through his layers, numbing his hands despite the insulated gloves, making his body shake with violent shivers that threatened his control of the snowmobile. Twice he nearly turned back, the survival instinct screaming that he was risking his life on a fool's errand. Each time, the image of Emma's flushed face and labored breathing steeled his resolve. He'd made a choice when he turned toward that stranded SUV instead of his farmhouse. This was simply following through on that choice, whatever the cost. 3. Grueling hours after leaving the farm, the lights of Riverdale appeared through the swirling snow, faint, flickering halos that might have been a mirage if Jack hadn't been expecting them. The town had lost power, but emergency generators kept critical buildings illuminated, creating islands of light in the darkness. The pharmacy was dark, but the pharmacist, Dale Jenkins, lived in the apartment above. Jack abandoned the snowmobile in what he hoped was the town square and fought his way to the building. His pounding on the door seemed pathetically weak against the storm's roar, but eventually a light appeared in the upstairs window. Dale, wrapped in a heavy bathrobe, opened the door with a shotgun in hand, a precaution Jack couldn't blame him for in these conditions. "Jack Donovan?" Dale's disbelief was evident even through the howling wind. "Man, what are you doing out in this? Thought you had more sense." "Child with pneumonia," Jack managed through lips so numb he could barely form words. "Stranded at my place. Needs antibiotics." Dale's expression shifted immediately from surprise to professional concern. "Get inside before you freeze solid. Tell me symptoms while I find what we need." The warmth of the pharmacy nearly undid Jack. As feeling returned to his extremities, the pain was excruciating, but he forced himself to describe Emma's condition as precisely as he could. Dale listened attentively, gathering medications from the locked cabinet behind the counter. "Broad-spectrum antibiotic," Dale explained, packaging several bottles. "Fever reducer, expectorant, children's cough suppressant for nighttime. Instructions are on each. Anything else you need while you're here?" Jack started to shake his head, then remembered his responsibility to his unexpected guests. Food supplies, whatever will keep without refrigeration, might be stuck for days. Dale nodded, moving toward the small grocery section of the pharmacy. He filled a bag with essentials, canned goods, powdered milk, crackers, energy bars, working quickly and efficiently. "What do I owe you?" Jack asked, reaching for Michael's wallet. Dale waved him off. "County Emergency Fund covers situations like this. Consider it handled." He fixed Jack with a stern look. "Now, you staying in town or trying that suicide run back to your place?" "Have to get back," Jack said simply. "They're counting on me." Dale looked like he wanted to argue, but recognized the futility. Instead, he added several chemical hand warmers and an emergency blanket to the supplies. "At least wait until I've made you some coffee." Dale insisted. "And I'm calling ahead to Martin's place. It's on your route back. He'll keep watch in case you don't make it through. Leave your engine running if you stop there." Jack nodded gratefully, accepting the steaming mug Dale pressed into his hands. As he drank, he noticed a newspaper on the counter, yesterday's edition of the Riverdale Gazette. The headline caught his eye. "Local bank to foreclose on historic Donovan farm." Dale followed his gaze and had the decency to look embarrassed. "Sorry, Jack, word gets around. For what it's worth, most folks in town think it's a damn shame what the bank's doing." Jack set down his mug, suddenly eager to leave. "It is what it is. Can't farm without money. Can't make money without farming. Circle's got to break somewhere." "Still," Dale said, 4 generations on that land means something." Jack didn't respond. He'd made his peace with losing the farm during those long hours on the snowmobile, focusing instead on the immediate task of helping Emma. The pain of that loss seemed distant now, overshadowed by a more pressing responsibility. The journey back to the farm was, if possible, even more treacherous than the outbound trip. The storm had intensified, the temperature dropped further, and Jack's body, despite the brief respite in the pharmacy, was near its limits of endurance. He pushed the snowmobile to its maximum safe speed, knowing that each minute counted for Emma. The old creek crossing, precarious on the first crossing, had deteriorated further. The ice bridge cracked ominously as Jack approached. He studied it, knowing he had no alternative route that wouldn't add hours to his journey. With a silent prayer, he opened the throttle and launched across. The ice gave way. The snowmobile's front end plunged into the frigid water, but momentum carried it forward. The powerful treads, finding purchase on the creek bottom and driving the machine up the far bank. Water had splashed over Jack, freezing almost instantly on his clothing. The added weight and cold were dangerous, but he was across, back on his own land with just 3 miles to go. When the farmhouse finally came into view, its windows glowing, with warm light through the snow, Jack felt a surge of relief so profound it brought unexpected tears to his eyes. He'd made it. The medicine would reach Emma in time. Whatever happened with the bank, with the farm, with his future, he'd kept faith with the land and the people it had placed in his care. Michael must have been watching for him. For the door opened before Jack could reach it. Strong hands helped him inside, where the blessed warmth made his frozen clothing steam and his numb limbs ache as circulation returned. "You made it," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were starting to worry." Jack fumbled with the bag of medications, his fingers too stiff to manage the simple task. "For Emma," he managed. "Dale said the antibiotic first, then the fever reducer." Sarah appeared from the bedroom, taking the medications with trembling hands. "She's sleeping fitfully. The cough's worse." "Medicine will help," Jack assured her, though his voice lacked conviction. He'd done all he could. The rest was beyond his control. As Sarah hurried back to Emma, Michael helped Jack out of his frozen outer layers. "You could have died out there," Michael said quietly, "for my daughter, a child you'd never met before today." Jack sank into his recliner by the wood stove, exhaustion washing over him in waves. "Didn't think about it that way," he admitted. "Just knew she needed help." Michael studied him for a long moment. "People like you are rare, Mr. Donovan. I won't forget what you've done for my family. Whatever you need, if it's in my power to give, it's yours." Jack nodded acknowledgement, too tired to respond further. As warmth slowly returned to his body, his eyes grew heavy. The last thing he remembered before sleep claimed him was Rusty settling at his feet, a familiar, comforting weight in a world that had been turned upside down. If you're feeling moved by Jack's selfless journey through the blizzard, give this video a thumbs up right now. Would you have risked your life for a stranger's child? Let us know in the comments below. And remember to subscribe. We share stories like this every week that remind us of the incredible strength of the human spirit. Now, let's return to Jack Donovan's farm to see what morning brings after that harrowing night. Jack awoke to sunlight streaming through the living room window, momentarily disoriented by the brightness after the storm's gloom. His body ached in protest as he slowly sat up in the recliner, every muscle a testament to yesterday's ordeal. The wood stove had burned down to embers, but the house was still comfortably warm. The power had held then. "Good morning," a small voice said, startling him. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor near his chair, petting Rusty with careful strokes. The transformation from the feverish, struggling child of last night was remarkable. Though still pale, her breathing was clear, her eyes bright and alert. "You look better," Jack observed, his voice rough with sleep. Emma nodded solemnly. "Mum says you went out in the storm to get my medicine. Dad says you're a hero." Jack shifted uncomfortably at the word. "Just did what needed doing. How you feeling?" "Better. The medicine tastes gross, but Mom says it's working." She tilted her head, studying him with the direct curiosity of childhood. "Is this really your farm? Like, all of it?" "For now," Jack said, the qualification automatic. He glanced at the calendar on the wall. December 29th. Just 2 days until the bank's deadline. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah emerging from the kitchen, carrying a steaming mug of coffee. "We didn't want to wake you," she said, offering the mug to Jack. "After what you did last night, well, we figured you needed the rest." Jack accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling the familiar awkwardness that always accompanied gratitude. "Storm break yet?" he asked, changing the subject. Sarah nodded. "About dawn, your brother called on the landline. Apparently he's been trying to reach you for 2 days. He's planning to come check on you once the county plows the main roads." Jack sipped his coffee, surprised by how good it tasted. Sarah had found his stash of real grounds, not the instant stuff he usually made do with. "Michael's outside," Sarah continued. "Said something about checking your equipment. Hope that's okay." Jack raised an eyebrow. Michael hadn't struck him as the mechanical type, but he appreciated the thought. "Fine by me. Not much to see, though. Most of it's seen better days." Emma had returned to petting Rusty, who had rolled onto his back in canine bliss. "Mum says we might be stuck here for a few more days. Is that okay? Do we have enough food?" "Plenty," Jack assured her, though in truth, feeding 5 extra mouths would deplete his modest pantry quickly. Dale's supplies from the pharmacy would help, but Jack had been shopping for 1, not 6. Still, he'd make do. Donovan's always did. The front door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and the sound of snow crunching under boots. Michael entered, followed by Lucas, both red-cheeked. From the cold, the transformation in Michael was as striking as Emma's. Gone was the anxious, out-of-place city dweller, replaced by a man whose confidence suggested he'd found his footing in this rural emergency. "Morning," Michael greeted Jack. "Hope you don't mind. Borrowed some tools from your barn. Wanted to check if we could dig out our SUV." Jack set down his coffee. "No point trying. County won't plow the side roads for days, maybe a week. Main routes get priority." Michael nodded, unsurprised. "That's what I figured, but I managed to reach my office on your landline. They're sending a helicopter as soon as the weather permits. Probably tomorrow. Advantage of working for a company with private aircraft." Jack blinked, reassessing his impression of the man before him. Not just a city dweller, then, but someone of considerable means or position. "A helicopter, huh? Don't see many of those around here except for medical emergencies." Michael smiled slightly. "Well, technically, this is a medical situation. Emma needs follow-up care, and we need to get back to Chicago. CEO privileges." "CEO?" Jack repeated, surprised. "Of Heartland Agricultural Cooperative," Michael confirmed. "We specialize in drought-resistant grains and sustainable farming technologies. I was out here visiting our Montana research station when the storm caught us." The irony wasn't lost on Jack. a man who made his fortune in agriculture being rescued by a farmer who was about to lose everything to agricultural economics. But he kept this observation to himself. "Lucky timing for us," he said instead, with genuine appreciation for Michael's help with Emma. After breakfast, a simple but satisfying meal of pancakes made from Jack's dwindling supply of flour, Jack pulled on his work clothes and headed outside to assess the damage from the storm. The world had been transformed overnight into a blinding white landscape, with drifts as high as the farmhouse eaves in places. The barn roof sagged alarmingly under the weight of snow, and somewhere beneath that pristine blanket lay his wheat field, his last hope, now buried and inaccessible. Jack began the laborious process of clearing paths to the essential buildings, shoveling with the steady rhythm that had defined much of his life on the farm. Michael joined him without being asked, taking a second shovel from the porch and working alongside in companionable silence. After an hour, they paused for breath, leaning on their shovels and surveying their progress. "Your harvester," Michael said finally, "the one I saw in the field yesterday, is it salvageable?" Jack shook his head. "Probably not. Moisture in the engine, electronics frozen. Even if the storm hadn't hit, it was on its last legs. And the wheat, what you were trying to harvest before the storm." "Under about 4 feet of snow now," Jack said, keeping his voice neutral. "Won't be accessible until spring thaw. By then it won't matter." Michael studied him for a long moment. "The bank?" Jack nodded, surprised by the man's perceptiveness. "December 31st, final deadline." "I saw the newspaper in your kitchen," Michael admitted. "I didn't mean to pry, but it was hard to miss." Jack turned back to his shoveling, uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. He had no interest in being pitied, especially by a man who probably made more money in a month than Jack had seen in years. "Jack," Michael said, his tone making it clear he wouldn't be deterred, "I want to help. What you did for my family, going out in that storm, risking your life for Emma, there's no way to repay that kind of courage, but I have resources, connections. Maybe I could speak to the bank." The offer, though kindly meant, stung Jack's pride. He paused mid-shovel, choosing his words carefully. "I appreciate the thought," he said finally. "But this isn't your problem to solve. Farm's been struggling for years. Storm was just the final straw." 4 generations on this land," Michael pressed. "That has to count for something," Jack resumed, shoveling, the physical exertion helping to mask the emotion he felt rising. "Counted for something once. Different world now. Small farms can't compete with corporate operations. Banks don't factor family history into their calculations." They worked in silence for another hour, clearing paths to the barn and storage shed. Jack was impressed by Michael's stamina. For a corporate CEO, the man wasn't afraid of manual labor. As they approached the storage shed where the snowmobile was kept, Michael paused. "Your grain," he said suddenly. "The wheat you were harvesting. Is it a standard variety?" Jack shook his head. "New strain, drought-resistant, high-yield. Invested everything I had in it after 2 failed seasons." Michael's interest visibly sharpened. "Which strain? Resi Wheat X7, Montana Gold?" "X7, Jack confirmed, surprised by Michael's knowledge. "Supposed to be 30% more efficient with water usage. Cost a fortune in seed, but the test plots looked promising." "Jack," Michael said slowly, "Resi Wheat X7 is one of our products. Heartland developed it. We've been looking for farms willing to plant it in real-world conditions, but most established operations are too risk-averse. Field data on a full 180-acre planting would be invaluable to our research division." Jack leaned on his shovel, trying to make sense of this information. "You're saying my crop has research value?" "Potentially significant value," Michael confirmed, "especially if you've been keeping detailed records." Jack almost laughed. "Donovans have been keeping records on every seed planted and bushel harvested since 1922. It's in the family Bible, along with births and deaths." Michael's expression transformed from interest to excitement. Data that comprehensive, tied to a specific soil composition and climate conditions, could advance our research by years. Jack, we would pay substantially for that information, not to mention rights to harvest and analyze the grain itself. For the first time since the storm began, Jack felt a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed by practicality. Doesn't help much with the bank's deadline. 2 days isn't enough time to negotiate. Research contracts, even if we could get to the wheat under all this snow. Michael seemed about to respond when a shout from the farmhouse interrupted them. Sarah stood on the porch, waving urgently. "Phone call," she called. "Patricia Winters from the bank." Jack's stomach dropped. He'd been expecting this call, but not so soon. Probably the bank calling to confirm the foreclosure proceedings, to make sure he understood the timeline for vacating the property. He handed his shovel to Michael and trudged toward the house, mentally preparing himself for the conversation. Sarah handed him the landline receiver with a sympathetic look. "She sounds very official," she whispered. Jack nodded thanks and took the phone into the kitchen for privacy. "Miss Winters," he answered, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Jack," Patricia's tone was formal but not unkind, "I'm calling about your loan situation." "I understand," Jack said, not wanting to prolong the inevitable. "The storm's buried the wheat. There's no way I'll make the payment by the deadline." "That's actually why I'm calling," Patricia continued. "Given the extreme weather conditions affecting the entire county, the bank's board has convened an emergency session to address loan situations like yours." Jack steeled himself. Here it came. Perhaps a few extra days to clear his possessions, a token gesture of compassion that wouldn't change the final outcome. "The board has authorized a 30-day extension for all agricultural loans affected by the blizzard," Patricia said. "This applies to your situation. Your new deadline would be January 31st. Jack's legs suddenly felt weak. He lowered himself into a kitchen chair. 30 days, he repeated, trying to process this unexpected development. "It's the most we can do within regulatory guidelines," Patricia explained. "I wish it could be more, Jack. Your family has been with this bank since it opened its doors. An extra month. Not salvation, but a reprieve. Time to—" What? The wheat would still be inaccessible, the harvester still broken beyond his means. To repair. The fundamental equation hadn't changed, just the timeline. "I appreciate it," Jack said finally, because some response was expected. "It's something, at least." After ending the call, Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at the calendar. On the wall, January 31st now loomed in his mind, replacing December 31st as the day he would lose everything. The brief flare of hope he'd felt at Michael's interest in his wheat had faded. 30 more days of uncertainty, of fighting the inevitable. Michael found him still sitting there minutes later, his coffee gone cold in the mug before him. "Bad news?" Michael asked carefully. Jack looked up, momentarily confused. "No, actually they extended the deadline. Storm affected the whole county, so they've given everyone an extra 30 days. Michael's face lit up. "Jack, that's perfect. A month gives us plenty of time to work something out with your wheat data. I'll have my research team contact you as soon as we're back in Chicago." Jack appreciated the man's enthusiasm, but couldn't share it. He'd been farming long enough to know that promises, especially those made in the emotional aftermath of personal crises, rarely materialized into meaningful help. Michael likely meant well, but once he returned to his corporate world, the plight of a struggling Montana farmer would fade from memory. "Sure," Jack said, not wanting to seem ungrateful. "That would be great." Michael seemed about to say more when Sarah appeared in the doorway, the baby on her hip and Emma at her side. "Weather report says we've got a clear window tomorrow morning," she announced. "Michael's office confirmed the helicopter will come for us at dawn." Jack nodded, surprised by the pang of what felt almost like disappointment. These strangers had upended his life, brought danger and uncertainty, Yet somehow, their presence had also filled the old farmhouse with a warmth and energy it hadn't known in years. "We'll be out of your hair soon," Michael said, misinterpreting Jack's expression. "I can't tell you how grateful we are for everything you've done." "No rush," Jack said, meaning it. "Roads won't be clear for days. Might as well have company while waiting." The remainder of the day passed in surprisingly comfortable domesticity. Jack showed Lucas how to feed the chickens that were housed in a sheltered coop attached to the barn. Sarah prepared a hearty stew from Jack's pantry supplies, filling the house with savory aromas. Michael continued helping with snow clearing, attacking the task with the same focus he presumably brought to running his company. That evening, as they gathered around the kitchen table for what would be their last meal, together, Jack found himself studying these people who had become so unexpectedly important in his life. Emma, now clearly recovering, chattering about the chickens. Lucas, proudly describing how he'd helped gather eggs. Sarah, rocking the baby while somehow managing to eat her own meal. And Michael, engaged in conversation with the children, his corporate identity momentarily invisible beneath the more fundamental role of father, family. That's what the scene reminded Jack of, the family meals of his childhood, when this kitchen had been filled with voices and laughter rather than solitary silence. The realization brought a complex ache, part nostalgia, part loss, part longing for something he'd stopped believing he could have again. As if sensing his thoughts, Michael raised his water glass. "A toast," he proposed, "to Jack Donovan, a man who embodies what it truly means to be a neighbor." "To Jack," the family echoed, the children's voices enthusiastic despite not fully understanding the sentiment. Jack ducked his head, embarrassed by the attention but moved despite himself. When he looked up, he found Michael watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. Something beyond gratitude, something that looked almost like calculation. Before Jack could puzzle it out, Emma had launched into a story about her school in Chicago, and the moment passed. Yet as Jack cleared the dishes later, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted during that brief exchange, something that would prove even more consequential than the bank's 30-day extension. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm's fury replaced by a pristine stillness that made the world seem reborn. Jack stood on his porch, watching the eastern horizon turn from grey to pink to gold, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. In the distance, the faint thrum of helicopter blades broke the morning silence, growing steadily louder. The Reeves family had packed their few belongings and now joined Jack on the porch, bundled against the cold. Emma slipped her small hand into Jack's, looking up at him with solemn eyes. "Will you visit us in Chicago sometime?" she asked. "Mom says you can stay in our guest room." Jack squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe someday," he said, though they both knew it was unlikely. His world was here for however much longer he had it. The helicopter appeared over the eastern ridge, sunlight glinting off its windshield as it circled once before settling gracefully in the cleared area of Jack's front yard. The downdraft kicked up a swirl of loose snow, momentarily transforming the pristine landscape into a glittering whirlwind. As the rotors slowed, a man in a business suit emerged, trudging through the snow toward the farmhouse. Jack recognized him immediately. Robert Chen, Michael's executive assistant, who had coordinated the rescue over the phone. "Mr. Reeves," Robert called above the diminishing rotor noise. "We've been worried sick. The storm knocked out all communications in this sector." Michael stepped forward to shake Robert's hand. "We were fortunate," he said, glancing back at Jack. "Very fortunate indeed." The goodbyes were brief but heartfelt. Sarah embraced Jack warmly, whispering thanks that made him uncomfortable with their earnestness. Lucas shook his hand with endearing seriousness, while Emma hugged him tight enough to make his ribs ache. The baby, oblivious to the significance of the moment, gurgled happily in Sarah's arms, Michael was the last to say goodbye. "I meant what I said about your wheat data," he assured Jack. "Expect a call from our research division within the week." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. He had allowed himself, just barely, to believe in the possibility that Michael's interest might translate into something real, perhaps not enough to save the farm, but at least enough to give him a fresh start somewhere. "And Jack," Michael added, his voice dropping so the others couldn't hear, "check your mailbox in a few days. I may have a proposition for you." Before Jack could ask what he meant, Michael was striding toward the helicopter. The family boarded quickly, and within minutes the aircraft was lifting off, carrying away the strangers who had so briefly but profoundly touched Jack's life. As the sound of the helicopter faded, the silence of the farm pressed in around Jack with renewed weight. Rusty nudged his hand, sensing his mood, and Jack scratched the dog's ears absently. "Just us again, boy," he murmured. "Back to normal." Except nothing felt normal anymore. The house, when he re-entered it, seemed emptier than before, the silence more profound than it had been in years. Jack busied himself washing breakfast dishes and changing bedsheets, trying to erase the evidence of his guests, but their presence lingered. A child's drawing left on the kitchen table, the faint scent of Sarah's perfume on a borrowed sweater, a teething ring discovered behind the sofa. By midday, Jack had run out of distractions. The temperature had risen enough to make outdoor work feasible, so he tackled the most pressing task, reinforcing the barn roof, which had begun to sag dangerously, under the weight of accumulated snow. For hours, he shoveled and hammered, the physical labor a welcome respite from his thoughts. 3 days passed in similar fashion. The county plow finally reached Jack's road, clearing a narrow path to his driveway. Dave called daily, concerned about Jack's isolation and the approaching bank deadline, now extended to January 31st. Jack assured his brother he was fine, sharing the news of the extension, but not Michael's vague promises about the wheat data. No sense raising hopes that might well come to nothing. On the 4th day, after the Reeves family's departure, Jack drove into Riverdale for supplies. The small town was still digging out from the historic blizzard, with snowbanks towering over. Parked cars and narrow paths carved between businesses on Main Street. At Miller's General Store, Jack found himself the center of unexpected attention. "There he is," called old Pete Miller from behind the counter. "Man of the hour." Jack froze, groceries in hand, as several customers turned to stare at him. "What?" Pete emerged from behind the counter, waving a copy of the Riverdale Gazette. "You're famous, Jack. Stories all over the front page." Jack set down his basket and accepted the newspaper with a growing sense of dread. The headline blared, "Local Farmers' Heroic Rescue of Stranded CEO During Blizzard." Beneath it was a photo Jack didn't recognize, himself standing on his porch next to Michael, both of them holding shovels. Someone must have taken it with a phone camera without his knowledge. The article detailed his rescue of the stranded family, his nighttime journey to the pharmacy on the ancient snowmobile, and identified Michael Reeves as the CEO of Heartland, Agricultural Cooperative, one of the nation's largest agricultural research and development companies. "How did they get this story?" Jack asked, scanning the text with mounting embarrassment. Pete shrugged. "Reporter called the pharmacy after hearing about your midnight medicine run. Dale said the CEO's office released a statement praising your extraordinary courage and selflessness. They're calling you a hero, Jack." Jack handed the paper back, uncomfortably aware of the admiring glances from other customers. "Just did what anyone would do," he muttered. "Not anyone would have ridden a 30-year-old snowmobile through the worst blizzard in decades to save a stranger's kid," Pete countered. "And word is, this CEO fella's not forgetting it either. Dale says he called the pharmacy personally to pay for all the supplies and medicine." Jack paid for his groceries quickly, eager to escape the attention. On his way out, several people stopped him to shake his hand or clap him on the shoulder. By the time he reached his truck, His face was burning with a mixture of embarrassment and something else. Pride, perhaps, at being recognized for something other than being the last Donovan about to lose the family farm. When Jack arrived home, he was surprised to find a sleek black SUV parked in his driveway, identical to the one Michael's family had abandoned in the snowdrift. For a wild moment, he thought they had returned, but the vehicle was unoccupied, tracks in the snow indicating the driver had walked to the house. Inside, Jack found Patricia Winters from the bank sitting at his kitchen table, a leather portfolio, open before her. She rose when he entered, extending her hand with uncharacteristic warmth. "Jack," she greeted him. "Hope you don't mind that I let myself in. Door was unlocked and it's freezing out there." Jack set down his groceries, unsettled by her presence. Bank officers didn't typically make house calls, especially in the aftermath of historic storms. "Ms. Winters," he acknowledged, shaking her hand briefly. "Something wrong with the 30-day extension?" Patricia shook her head, resuming her seat at the table. "Quite the opposite. I'm here because of some unusual developments regarding your loan situation." Jack remained standing, wary of whatever news had brought her all the way out to his farm. "What kind of developments?" Patricia tapped the portfolio before her. "This morning, the bank received a rather extraordinary communication from Heartland. Agricultural Cooperative, specifically from CEO Michael Reeves." Jack's pulse quickened. "Michael. He has proposed a comprehensive agricultural research partnership utilizing your farm," Patricia continued, her normally reserved expression softening into something like amazement. "The terms are, well, frankly, they're unlike anything I've seen in 30 years of agricultural banking." She slid a document across the table toward Jack. He picked it up with hands that weren't quite steady, scanning the densely typed proposal. The words blurred before his eyes, but certain phrases jumped out. 10-year research contract, advanced drought-resistant wheat varieties, genetically optimized for Montana soil conditions, on-site research facility, retention of current farm ownership, annual compensation package. Jack nodded, still processing. "I need some time to think about it." "Of course, the offer isn't contingent on an immediate decision." Patricia gathered her papers, preparing to leave. "But Jack, speaking personally, not as your loan officer, this seems like the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime." After she departed, Jack sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the proposal and Michael's letter before him. He thought about his father, about his grandfather, about all the Donovans who had worked this land through drought and flood, depression and prosperity. They had survived by adapting, by embracing innovation while holding fast to core values. Jack rose and moved to the hallway, studying the photograph Michael had mentioned. There, beside his father, stood a lean, serious-looking man with the same determined eyes Jack had noticed in Michael. William Reeves, the man whose ideas had saved Donovan Farm during the drought of '54, and whose grandson now offered a new kind of salvation 70 years later. The circle was indeed closing, in ways none of them could have imagined when Jack first heard that desperate car horn through the blizzard. Outside, the winter sun was beginning its early descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields. Jack stepped onto the porch, Rusty following faithfully. From here, he could see the eastern fields where his wheat lay beneath the snow. No longer a desperate last hope, but the beginning of something new and unexpected. For the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to look beyond the immediate crisis, beyond the next payment or the next season. 10 years of secure funding, research that might help other farmers facing the same climate challenges, a partnership rooted in a history deeper than he'd known. The farm would remain Donovan land. The legacy would continue, though in a form his ancestors couldn't have envisioned. And Jack would be not just the man who nearly lost the family farm, but the one who transformed it into something that might benefit farmers for generations to come. He thought about Emma, about her serious eyes as she'd asked him to visit Chicago. Perhaps that was a promise he could keep after all. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew Jack's attention to the driveway. Dave's truck appeared, moving carefully along the plowed but still treacherous road. Behind it came another vehicle, then another. Neighbors coming to check on him, no doubt, after reading about his rescue of the stranded CEO in the Riverdale Gazette. Jack descended the porch steps to greet them, the weight of recent days lifting slightly with each footfall. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack Donovan faced the future not with dread, but with hope. 2 days after Patricia's visit, Jack sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the final details of the contract with Heartland Agricultural Cooperative. Dave sat across from him, having insisted on being present when Jack signed the documents. The kitchen radio played softly in the background, the local station reporting on continued cleanup efforts throughout the county following the historic blizzard. "I still can't believe it," Dave said, shaking his head as he examined the terms. Outlined in the agreement, a 10-year research partnership, full ownership retention, and this compensation package. He whistled softly. "It's more than fair, Jack. It's generous beyond imagination." Jack nodded, running his finger along the signature line where his name would soon transform the course of Donovan Farm forever. "Michael says the research potential justifies the investment. Apparently our soil conditions are ideal for their drought-resistant wheat program, and 4 generations of crop data is priceless to their research team. And this connection with his grandfather, what are the odds?" Dave marveled. "It's like something out of a storybook." Jack had shared Michael's letter with his brother, who had been as astonished as Jack himself at the revelation of their family's historical connection. The photograph of their father with William Reeves now sat prominently on the kitchen table, a tangible reminder of how past and present had converged in ways none of them could have predicted. "I keep wondering what Dad would think," Jack said, quietly. "About the farm becoming a research station." Dave considered this. "You remember how excited he got about new agricultural techniques? How he was always the first in the county to try something innovative? I think he'd be proud, Jack. The farm stays in the family, but it also serves a greater purpose, helping develop crops that could save other family farms facing the same challenges we did." Jack nodded, comforted by his brother's perspective. His phone chimed with an incoming text, a message from Sarah Reeves, with a photo of Emma holding a handmade card that read, "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," in colorful crayon letters. The little girl's recovery was complete, her smile bright and healthy. These messages had been arriving daily since the family's departure, keeping the connection alive despite the distance. Michael had called twice to discuss contract details, but the conversations had invariably drifted to more personal topics. Jack's plans for the farm, Michael's vision for the research partnership, and increasingly a genuine friendship developing between two men from vastly different worlds who had found unexpected common ground. A knock at the door interrupted Jack's thoughts. He opened it to find Dale Jenkins from the pharmacy, holding a large gift basket. "Community collection," Dale explained, looking slightly embarrassed as he thrust the basket into Jack's hands. "Everyone wanted to do something after reading about your blizzard rescue in the Gazette. Nothing fancy, just home-baked goods, preserves, that sort of thing." Jack accepted the basket awkwardly. "Not necessary, but thank you. Tell everyone I appreciate it." Dale hesitated, clearly with more to say. "There's something else. Town Council met yesterday. They're naming you Citizen of the Year at the Founders' Day celebration next month. Mayor wants to know if you'll give a speech." Jack groaned inwardly. Public speaking was decidedly not his forte. "Tell her I'm honored, but Jack," Dave interjected from the kitchen doorway, "you're accepting. Dad would have loved this." After Dale departed, promising to convey Jack's reluctant acceptance to the mayor, The brothers returned to the contract on the kitchen table. "You ready to sign?" Dave asked, sensing Jack's lingering hesitation. Jack picked up the pen, turning it slowly between his fingers. "It still doesn't feel real. 3 weeks ago I was preparing to lose everything. Now you're saving it," Dave finished for him. "Through the same values that built it in the first place, helping others when they needed it, without thought of reward." Jack nodded, touched by his brother's understanding. With a steady hand, he signed his name to the contract that would transform Donovan Farm into the Heartland Cooperative Research Station, while keeping it firmly in Donovan hands. No sooner had he set down the pen than the sound of vehicles approaching drew both men to the window. Jack frowned in confusion at the sight that greeted them. A procession of farm equipment, tractors, combines, pickup trucks loaded with tools, was making its way up his long driveway. At the lead was a brand-new combine harvester, its red paint gleaming in the winter sunlight. "Were you expecting company?" Dave asked, equally bewildered. Jack shook his head, stepping onto the porch as the vehicles pulled into the yard. He recognized many of the drivers, neighboring farmers, some from as far as 50 miles away. The new combine came to a stop directly in front of the house, and from it emerged a familiar figure, Michael Reeves, bundled against the Montana cold, but grinning broadly. "What's all this?" Jack called as Michael approached, gesturing to the impressive array of equipment and volunteers filling his yard. Michael clasped Jack's hand warmly. "The Donovan-Heartland partnership officially began when you signed that contract. I had a feeling you'd do it today. But the equipment first. Phase of the research station setup," Michael explained. "That new combine is specially designed for our test plots. The rest," he nodded toward the assembled farmers and their equipment, "is a community response. When word got out about our partnership, your neighbors volunteered to help prepare the land for spring planting. And they had another idea as well." At Michael's signal, a second vehicle pulled forward, an enormous snow removal machine typically used for clearing airport runways. "They tell me your winter wheat is still viable under all that snow," Michael continued. "With this equipment, we can clear enough of the eastern field to validate the crop's resilience and gather preliminary data. It won't be a full harvest, but it'll be a start, and symbolic of what's to come." Jack stared at the assembled farmers, many of whom he'd known his entire life, but had grown distant from during his recent financial struggles. Now they stood in his yard, ready to help salvage what they could of his wheat crop, not because they had to, but because they chose to. "I don't know what to say," Jack admitted, emotion threatening to close his throat. "Don't need to say anything," responded Jim Hadley, his nearest neighbor for 30 years. "You'd do the same for any of us, have done plenty of times." For the remainder of that clear, cold January day, Jack's farm hummed with activity it hadn't seen in decades. The massive snow removal equipment carved paths through the eastern wheat field, revealing surprisingly intact crops beneath the protective blanket of snow. Michael's research team, arriving by helicopter midday, took samples and readings, their excitement growing as they confirmed the wheat's exceptional hardiness. By sunset, nearly 10 acres of Jack's wheat had been harvested, a fraction of the total crop, but enough to provide valuable research data and, more importantly, to demonstrate the potential of the Donovan-Heartland partnership. The mood was celebratory as the volunteers gathered in and around Jack's farmhouse for a hastily organized meal, the kitchen windows steaming with warmth against the gathering darkness outside. Standing on his porch, watching the community that had come together to help transform his darkest moment into an unexpected beginning, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude and wonder. The farm that had been his burden for so long now felt like the center of something larger and more meaningful than he could have imagined. Michael joined him, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. "Your father would be proud," he said, echoing Dave's earlier sentiment as he handed Jack a mug. Jack accepted it with a nod of thanks. "I like to think so, though I doubt he could have envisioned all this." He gestured toward the yard filled with vehicles and people. "I don't know," Michael mused. "From what my grandfather told my father about Joseph Donovan, he was a man who understood that farms survive through community and innovation. That's still true today, just on a different scale." They stood in companionable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the clear winter sky. In the eastern field, the partially harvested wheat stood as a testament to resilience, both of the crop itself and of the man who had planted it. "You know," Michael said finally, "when I was a boy, my grandfather used to tell me that true wealth isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give away. I never fully understood that until I watched you walk into that blizzard to save my daughter, knowing what it might cost you." Jack shifted uncomfortably at the praise. "Did what anyone would do." Michael shook his head. "No, Jack, not anyone. That's the point." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You gave everything you had to save my family, without hesitation or calculation. I don't believe in coincidence anymore, not after discovering our family's connection. Some circles are meant to close." Inside the farmhouse, someone had started playing an old piano Jack had almost forgotten existed. The melody drifted through the open door, a folk song his father had often played on long winter evenings. The sound of it now, amid the murmur of conversation and occasional laughter, seemed to bridge past and present in a way that made Jack's chest tight with emotion. "To the future of Donovan Farm," Michael said, raising his mug in toast. "And to chance encounters in blizzards," Jack added, tapping his mug against Michael's. As they turned to rejoin the gathering inside, Jack caught sight of the family Bible on the kitchen table, open to the pages where generations of Donovans had recorded their triumphs and challenges, their harvests and hopes. Later tonight, he would add a new entry, not an ending, as he had feared just weeks ago, but a continuation, an evolution of the legacy his family had built on this land. For now, though, he simply allowed himself to be present in this moment of transformation, surrounded by the community he had always been part of, but had somehow forgotten during his years of struggling alone. The farm wouldn't be lost after all. The Donovan name would remain on this land, and the work done here might help countless other family farms survive in a changing world. All because he had chosen, in the midst of his own crisis, to answer a distant call for help. The snow-covered fields of Donovan Farm glisten in the morning sunlight as our camera pulls back, revealing the sprawling property with its historic farmhouse and the new research facility being constructed nearby. The narrative. Voice returns, reflective and warm. When Jack Donovan heard a desperate cry for help during that historic blizzard, he faced a choice that would change everything. He could focus on saving his failing farm, the culmination of 4 generations of family history, or he could risk it all to help strangers in need. His decision reveals a profound truth about the human spirit, that our most selfless acts often lead to our greatest rewards, though rarely in ways we can predict. Jack couldn't have known that the stranded family he rescued would have a connection to his own family's past. He couldn't have foreseen that his sacrifice would ultimately save not just the Reeves family, but the very legacy he thought he was losing. This is the mysterious power of kindness. It creates ripples that extend far beyond our vision, sometimes returning to us when we need them most. Today, Donovan Farm stands as both a working agricultural operation and a cutting-edge research facility, developing drought-resistant crops that may help thousands of family farms survive climate challenges. Jack still lives in the farmhouse his great-grandfather built, honoring the past while embracing a future he never imagined. And each winter, when the snow falls thick across the Montana plains, the Reeves family returns to the farm for a visit, a tradition that bridges two families, two worlds, and honors a moment of courage that changed everything. Perhaps there's a lesson here for all of us. In our most desperate moments, when we face impossible choices between self-preservation and helping others, the path of generosity, though harder and seemingly more dangerous, often leads to unexpected blessings. If Jack's story touched your heart today, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. In the comments below, share a time when an act of kindness, either one you gave or received, changed the course of your life in ways you never expected. Your stories remind us all that we're connected in ways we can't always see, but that profoundly shape our journey. This is Jennifer Wilson for Lives Transformed, reminding you that sometimes our greatest moments of loss become our most powerful opportunities for transformation. If we have the courage to keep our hearts open to others, even when our own future seems most uncertain. Until next time, remember that kindness is never wasted, even when its rewards aren't immediately visible. The seeds of compassion we plant today may grow into forests of opportunity we never imagined possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.